The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Fransson. Tonight's episode is The Limits of Knowing.
Welcome, everyone. This is Wade Fransson. I'm here in the studio recording the December 30th episode of Created in the Image of God. So it's Tuesday night, 8 p.m. This is normally a live show, but it's also my wife's birthday, and I'm on vacation. So my guest, who's here in the studio with me, has agreed graciously to do this as a pre-recorded show. And what a guest he is. Alan Lightman, whose last name kind of signifies perhaps some of his life's work. He is a novelist, essayist, physicist, and educator. He's the professor of life practice of the practice of the humanities at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And until 2003, he was the senior lecturer in physics and the John Burchard Professor of the Humanities at MIT. Quite a resume. Welcome to the studio, Alan.
Thank you for having me, Wade.
Well, and Alan, I appreciate all the more your graciousness at being a guest, because this show appeals largely to a religious audience. I mean, we do have philosophers, we've got educators, but, we have a lot of pastors. We have a lot of people involved in theology. We've got rabbis and some imams and so on in the audience. And what I want to do is invite you to unpack your particular approach as a physicist to the universe and the awe and wonder that you bring to this discussion over the course of this show. But first, let's get to know you a little better. If you don't mind going back in time to not billions of years as you might do for the Big Bang, but the Big Bang of Alan Lightman, right? Who were your parents? What were the forces that brought you into this world and that shaped you in those early years?
Well, I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and my father was a businessman, although his real instincts were as an artist. He drew cartoons and things like that. My mother was a dance teacher and also did a volunteer brailleist. So she created braille manuscripts for blind people.
Wow. So was there blindness somehow in her family or background that led her to that? What was the origin of that?
No, there was no blindness in the family. She just felt a calling to do this. My parents were both well educated, and I have 3 younger brothers, and we had very interesting conversations at the dinner table. So it was a wonderful upbringing. My father never pushed me into joining the family business, which was movie theaters. He owned a bunch of movie theaters, and I did watch a lot of movies as a young person, and this had a big impact on me as a writer, seeing that you could look at a scene from different angles and where the camera was, and you could set scenes. So people have told me that my writing is very cinematic, and I think it stemmed from that early age of going to lots of movies. I had an interest as a child in both the sciences and the arts. I wrote poetry and read short stories, but I also built rockets and remote control devices and things like that. So I had an early interest in both the sciences and the arts.
Well, so different perspectives on that last name as well. I'm sure with your father owning movie studios, Lightman, there might have been a reference here or there or a joke about his profession. But I'm curious also, what kind of cartoons, and is it anything anyone here would be familiar with that he was involved in?
He one of the things that I remember is he illustrated nursery rhymes, like "Oh Mother Hubbard," and I didn't actually see this, but I was told that my pediatrician's office that I went to was as a child, that he decorated the walls of that office with his cartoons of Old Mother Hubbard and other characters that appear in nursery rhymes. So he was very good at that, and he did try to encourage me to draw, but I was never a very good drawing artist.
So where did the obviously the rockets, right? That was probably part of the whole move towards physics and whatnot. But when did that educational pursuit start in earnest for you?
Well, I was very interested in science and mathematics as a youngster, and I think most of the scientists that I have known were interested from a young age in science. It turned out when I got to college and took science courses that I realized that there were other students who were much better at building things, much better at their hands than I was. So I became a theoretical scientist working with mathematics. Even though I built a lot of things as a child, there were other people who could build much better than me. So in college, I steered myself in the direction of theoretical science. I also continued to write poetry in college. And when I got to graduate school, which was in physics, I actually began publishing some of my poems in literary magazines. I was also very interested in philosophy, and in college I minored in philosophy, and in graduate school, even though I was getting a PhD in physics, I took a couple of philosophy courses, which was quite unusual.
So help ground us a little bit in what kind of applications on the mathematical, the theoretical physics side. What were some questions or projects or whatever that you were working on?
Well, I was a graduate student in physics from 1970 to 1974. And in 1971, the first black hole was discovered in space. And I was one of a handful of physics graduate students around the world who began working on black holes. And when I say working on black holes, I mean figuring out how a black hole would reveal itself, considering the fact that it doesn't emit any light. Its gravitational field is so strong that even light can't escape. But if a black hole is in a astrophysical environment with other stars nearby, gas nearby, the gas can heat up and radiate in a way that is indicative of the black hole. And stars can orbit the black hole in a way that's indicative of there being a black hole. So I worked on projects like that.
And one name that immediately comes to mind is Stephen Hawking, right? He was very active in that space. I don't know exactly the time frame, but Did you interact with him and some of his
Yes.
theories?
Yes,
Some
I
of his
did.
ideas.
I didn't collaborate with Hawking on anything, but I met him a number of times. And when I was a graduate student and for several years afterwards, I went to the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge, England, at the Cambridge University, and that's where he was located. And I met him a number of times there and worked with other people there who were colleagues of his.
Well, and speaking of cartoons, another thing I always think of is The Far Side, right? Because you have these, you're familiar with Gary Larson, The Far Side. You have
Right.
these scientists in some room doing equations and whatnot, and then you have this sort of inane, like almost kindergarten antics of them, arguing over a theorem or somebody's, spilling a flask of whatever. I mean, can't remember the exact jokes, but so were there like competing ideas, and were there sort of moments that were memorable in human terms as you're deep involved in these heavy mathematical equations and figuring out these big ideas? I'm just curious, what it was like working then with other people in that same kind of, and perhaps not in the same room, but perhaps across published articles, if you know what I mean.
Well, it was an exciting time, and I think probably every era has exciting things going on. When I was in graduate school, I worked in the group of Kip Thorne. He was a very famous physicist, and he won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. He was the leading theorist on the project that discovered gravitational waves. And these are waves of energy that are the analog of light waves, except they're produced by large masses, and they reveal things about the universe that light does not reveal. For example, the collision of two black holes would create gravitational waves from which you would infer information. And Kip was began working on that project to discover gravitational waves when I was a student there. But there were a lot of international visitors, very famous physicists from around the world that would come and visit his group. And that was quite exciting. Of course, there were also great physicists at Caltech, like Richard Feynman. I don't know whether you come across him or some of your listeners have.
Yeah, both of those names are familiar. I've been reading Scientific American for decades, sort of as a layperson, and look at you because I'm fascinated by this stuff. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, Richard Feynman, who is also a Nobel Prize winner, was on my PhD thesis committee. So that means he was one of the three people who who conducted the oral exam to decide whether I was smart enough to get a PhD. And I remember that. So I'm sitting in a room with three other physicists. One of them is Richard Feynman, and I'm standing at the blackboard trying to answer their questions. And Feynman was the first person who asked me a question, and I was able to work out the answer on the blackboard fairly easily. The second person who asked me a question was also Richard Feynman. And this question was just a little bit beyond my grasp. And I struggled with it. It took me like 20 minutes to come up with the answer. And for the rest of the 3 hours, Feynman didn't make a peep. He didn't say a single word. And weeks later, I realized that with those two questions, he had exactly bracketed my knowledge. He knew exactly how smart I was and no smarter. And that's all. That was his only interest in questioning me, is to find out exactly where my knowledge stacked up in the field of physics.
I'm reminded of that Einstein quote, "Things must be made as simple as they can be and no simpler."
Yes,
right? He nailed exactly where you were on the continuum.
He
and
nailed
that was
it.
important to him.
Yes.
Well, wow. So meanwhile, you're taking at least some philosophy classes. So what was that intersection like? What was the particular area of philosophy that was appealing to you at that time?
Well, I was interested in the classical philosophers like Hegel and Kant and Nietzsche, but I was also interested in the philosophical questions raised by physics. And physics, among all other sciences, raises the deepest philosophical questions. How did the universe begin? Why is there something rather than nothing? Is life special in the universe? Do you need special conditions for a universe to have life? And these questions are at the frontiers of physics, and being philosophically minded as I was and still am, that attracted me to philosophy.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. So, in that regard, those questions, studying particularly black holes. When I think of that, black holes, quantum physics, are armchair amateurs, right? Who see these things, come up with ideas. I've done this, right, based on what I come from. You see in the back of me is the sun and the moon.
Yes.
And I always go back to the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and it says he put the greater and lesser lights in heaven, right? And I've often gone back to Genesis and sort of noodled around on these same questions. But for you, you're actually there doing the math and able to, have a PhD dissertation discussion with people who have won the Nobel Prize. So what are some of the conclusions or maybe ahas that you were either searching or perhaps even accomplished as you were looking at that intersection of your study around the black holes, meanwhile taking some philosophy classes? Were there any particular sort of epiphanies that came to you? Einstein famously said, I want to know God's thoughts, the rest are details. And whatever he meant by God, who knows? But
yeah. Well, I'm thinking about that.
So, for example, we had an interview with George Musser, who was the cosmology editor of Scientific American, and he was, during that period, he was looking at the emergence of consciousness, right, through the lens of physics. That was one of the areas that he was really exploring.
Yeah.
And
I don't think physics is the right field for the study consciousness.
Yeah.
I think that's a question of neuroscience. But I can give you an example of something where I think my philosophical and scientific interests intersect. There, people since the 1960s, physicists have noted that our universe has very special properties to allow the emergence of life. And I'm not talking about just only life like us. I mean, life of any kind. You need complex atoms to form life. And those atoms can only be made in stars because our universe was, at the beginning, was much too hot to have large atoms in it. They would come apart. And to make stars, you need various conditions. You need a universe that's not expanding too quickly and not expanding too slowly, and a bunch of other things you need in order to make stars. And so physicists began raising the question, and this started with the 60s, but has come up to the present. Why is it that our universe has these special properties to allow the emergence of life? And there are basically two explanations for that. One is the theological explanation, which is that God made the universe and God wanted there to be life for whatever reasons God had, and so made a universe that would have the right conditions to produce life. The other explanation, which is called the multiverse idea, is that there are many, many different universes with lots of different properties. You know, some of them have a very slow speed of light. Some of them have 13 dimensions instead of 3 dimensions. Some of them have stars. Some of them don't have stars. Some of them have life. Some of them don't have life. And that our universe is, by definition, since we're here to talk about it, is one of those universes that allows the existence of life. And the argument is kind of the same as saying, asking, why is it that planet Earth, among all of the planets in our solar system, seems to have the right condition for life? We have liquid water, we have oxygen. Almost all the other planets in our solar system do not have the right conditions for life, and we certainly haven't found it elsewhere. So you can ask, why is it that planet Earth has the right conditions for life? And the answer is that there are lots and lots of other solar systems in the universe and just in our galaxy with many different conditions. And some of them have planets that are the right distance from their central star to have oxygen and liquid water and so on. So that's kind of analogous to the multiverse explanation of why our universe has the right conditions for life. Now, where the philosophical dimension comes in, I mean, for one thing, you can take the theological explanation and then you're done.
Right.
which is fine. You know, that's
just to put all those questions in a different box, because all those same questions exist about whatever entity one would call God. And,
yes. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you take that route for explaining things, you're done. But the multiverse explanation is tricky because there's no way that we can contact these other universes. Sort of by definition, they're out of causal contact, either now or in the infinite future. So we can't prove that they exist. And we have to accept their existence purely as a matter of faith, which is sort of like our faith in God. You know, in both cases, you have faith in something that you can't prove. And I find that juxtaposition very interesting.
Is it poetic? Is it irony? Is it humor? We'll ask some of those questions when we come back. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have more with Alan Lightman on the intersection of physics and philosophy through the eyes of Alan Lightman. We'll be right back.
My name is Alan Lightman. I'm a scientist and a writer. I've always been fascinated by that unique sensation we call consciousness. The feeling of being present in the world.
Whoa.
How does all that emerge from a collection of atoms and molecules?
We have sort of also a concept of consciousness, mind, chit.
What does it mean to be human in a world rapidly changing with new science and technology?
It is nice to meet you, Alan.
Let's push even further to see where we humans fit in the cosmos.
Everything we do is connected with understanding the Big Bang and understanding how the universe came about.
We are nature coming to know itself. I find that awesome, like really awesome, wondrous.
In some ways, this moment, this single moment, is just as vital as the billions of years of the cosmos. Every moment is a gift, if only we can grab onto it.
I find this adventure that is not only a scientific adventure, but also a human adventure.
We're like explorers, right? As scientists, we're always pushing the boundary of what we know. It's a thrilling experience, and it's also a bit addictive in a sense.
Whatever this strange universe we find ourselves in, we're part of it. We're connected. That's meaning for me.
Welcome back. Right before the break, Alan had come to the conclusion of his discussion about the intersection of theoretical physics and philosophy, in particular around the question of origin. And we found out that either way, you end up with something that you can't prove, right? So this theory of multiverses, I was actually going to ask the question, if we can't, through infinity, I think you said, ever really truly know because we don't have causal contact with those alternative universes, then is there evidence for them? And is that evidence merely theoretical?
It's theoretical. And some of our theories of physics, like the inflationary universe theory, actually predicts the existence of these other universes. That doesn't mean that they actually exist, because there are many theories in physics which predict things that don't actually exist, but predict other things that do exist. So it has some scientific bedrock, but there's no experimental evidence that these other universes exist. And this is kind of a caw in our throats, because it raises the question of what is legitimate science. And if you have a theory that you can't prove, is that really science, or is it more philosophy or even theology? You know, what is it? Because the long march of science through the centuries has been based upon experimental proof. I mean, even some of our most far out theories like quantum physics and Einstein's general relativity eventually had experimental proof, confirmation.
One of the questions that came to me years ago, must be close to 20 now, when I started reading Scientific American religiously, and pun intended, was Fotina Marco-Polo Palamara. Have you heard of her? She's a theoretical physicist who did some math equations that proved that something didn't exist until it was observed. Have you heard of that particular theoretical statement? And this was a peer-reviewed, set of equations, and I don't understand how math like that could be done, but I trust that it can be.
Well,
right?
I imagine that came out of quantum physics.
Right.
That's a quantum idea that
Yep.
the observer plays a critical role.
Absolutely. Yep.
And we know actual phenomena that are along those lines. I wouldn't put it exactly like that. It doesn't exist until it's observed, but I would say that its properties are not definite until it's observed. And there's a very famous experiment in quantum physics that was, I think, was probably first done in the 1940s or maybe even earlier, called the double slit experiment.
Right, with light and whether
Yeah.
it's a photon or wave, right?
Yeah, whether it's a particle or wave, and it depending on how you observe it, it can either be a wave or it can be a particle, depending on how you observe it. So the observer, and it could be a machine that observes it, doesn't have to be a human mind, determines its properties. And until it's actually observed, it has properties of both a wave and a particle, which are sometimes contradictory with each other. So it could be that this physicist that you were referring to was herself referring to things like that. I think she put it a little extremely when she said it doesn't exist at all until it's observed.
It's possible that I'm conflating something here, but it was a step forward. The analogy was, if a tree falls in the forest
Right.
and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? And her answer was no, it doesn't.
Right.
And which would coincide with what you just said. Its properties were not defined, i.e. sound. What does it sound like?
Yeah.
So that led to, some reflection on, again, consciousness, which, as you've pointed out, okay, we need to look at, the analysis of neuroscience, right? And yet, things that you've been involved in, like poetry, and your parents, the cartoons and the dance, those things, can those things be scientifically described, or do they exist in some different realm outside of science?
Yeah, I don't think that science is the right tool for describing those things. It's like trying to hammer a nail with a screwdriver. It's the wrong tool.
So
science,
that would mean there would be limits to science.
Oh, there definitely. Yes.
How would you sort of describe, and I'm not seeking to pin you down, this is just a curious conversation, how would you seek to describe those limits and where science would break down and become ineffective?
Well, I totally agree with you that science has limits. It's been very, very powerful as a tool for advancing humankind. It's brought us antibiotics and microchips and everything else, but it does have limits of validity. And I think that there are questions of aesthetics, of ethics, that fall outside of the realm of science. For example, is it ethical to kill an enemy soldier in time of war? That's a very important question, but it's not a question that lies within the realm of science. What is beauty? I think, would we be happier if we lived to be 1,000 years old? My answer to that is depends on who your in-laws are. But anyway,
got to be careful about that. We celebrated my mother-in-law's 80th birthday just yesterday, and we were out to dinner, and it was a wonderful dinner.
Well, your mother-in-law is definitely an exception to what I just said.
Yeah.
So anyway, there are questions like that which fall outside of the realm of science. And I had an experience, what I would call a transcendent experience a few years ago that I actually wrote about, in which it was late at night, and I was out in the ocean in a small boat. It was after midnight, and there were no other boats on the water, and I decided to turn off the engine of the boat, and it got even quieter. And then I turned off the running lights of the boat, and it got even darker. And I lay down on my back and just looked up at the sky. And it was a very clear night, and the stars were vivid pricks of light.
Which body of water was this? I'm just geographically.
Well, it was in Casco Bay in Maine, and my wife and I spend our summers every year in this area of Maine. And after a few moments, I felt like I was falling into infinity. I lost all track of my ego. I lost track of time. And I felt like I was merging with something much, much larger than myself. Now, I think that you could, if you had a giant computer and you could record every neuron in my brain and knew the electrical impulse of every neuron in my brain, you would still not have understood the experience I was having. And that's an example where science just isn't the right tool to describe what's happening. So that's an example of the limits of science, besides the other questions that I raised, you know, like, is it ethical to kill an enemy soldier in time of war?
So let me ask you then, this is going to go in a completely different direction for a moment. And again, it's just my personal curiosity, something I've struggled with, right? So in understanding science and its applications, let me frame it this way. If you're familiar with the Bible and biblical prophecy and the book of Revelation, right? You have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and you have these catastrophic predictions of, you know, doom and gloom that come at mankind in the end. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are the red horse of war, the pale horse of famine, there's another horse of disease, right? Well, this used to be the role of religion to sort of give these apocalyptic warnings, but it seems like science, in quotes, has taken on that role in recent decades with, you know, dire warnings of climate change ending all human life, with the pandemic, right? Threatening all human life to the point where politicians are locking down the entire nations, stopping our kids from going to school, forcing us to take certain vaccines. It's kind of a weird, you know, transition from a world where religion had a dominant role to a world where science has a dominant role. And that's just a backdrop to the question here. Let's get back to this question about, is it ethical to kill an enemy soldier? Well, and I think you rightly said, well, that's not really a question science can answer, but lots of people could pose different questions, could pose different hypotheses related to that soldier dying. And they could scientifically discover, is it better for our nation to kill that soldier or to take him on as a prisoner of war? And now you could look at this through the lens of economics and the burden on society, or, you know, would we be better off killing him and then therefore forgetting about him, or would we be better off keeping him in prison for life if he was a traitor, for example, right? So my point is, you know, science would frame it through different hypotheses without necessarily answering the question, are we asking the right question?
Well, those are all of the things that you mentioned, which are all, you know, legitimate ways to evaluate. They all involve value judgments. And the value judgment would depend somewhat on the person who's making the judgment. We don't all have the same values. It's not like, you know, a physicist drops a ball from 2 meters high and can calculate exactly how many seconds it'll take to hit the floor. And every physicist in the world agrees with that number. We have different value systems. And so even though, you know, an economist might analyze it one way and a war historian might analyze it another way, I mean, people still debate whether it was right for the U.S. to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And we're still debating it, and there are arguments on both sides.
Well, that's a great question. I've actually spoken about that relatively recently, because I did a little research into, you know, one of the big questions was, you know, this was necessitated in the eyes of America because they were demanding unconditional surrender, and that was not going to be granted. Meanwhile, Russia was coming in and they were trying to broker some kind of peace agreement, and they were not demanding unconditional surrender. But the question was, at that time, a lot of Japanese viewed their emperor as a god, and they were never. So to your point, you got all these convoluted questions, but this is a really great point in time, because the other thing I wanted to ask is, you get these incentive structures that are built up around big science, global science. You've got incentive structures and lobbyists in different countries around, clean energy and, around medicine, right? And vaccines and treatments. And so these incentive structures tend to skew what research is being done and who's paying for the research. And there's this meme out there that says, they told me to follow the science, I followed the money, and I found the science, right? So this is a big question. What's your take on that for these really big global questions about the future of humanity? Are we really doing pure science, or how does pure science get done when you have these massive incentive structures that get built over time?
Yes. Well, I agree with you. There are incentive structures, economic and political. I think that there is pure science on all of these issues, in the sense that there is evidence-based critical thinking. For example, let's take the question, is climate change caused by human beings? Okay, which is a central question in discussing climate change. And there are many people who say it's not caused by human beings. That it's just, a temporary fluctuation. But there's a lot of scientific evidence that it is caused by human beings, and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which is the organization that has the elite scientists in the United States, there's a consensus there based on all kinds of data that climate change is caused by human beings. So that's the scientific fact. And also there's science behind the question of what is it that human beings are doing that's causing climate change. We're putting carbon products into the air, many of them generated by fossil fuels. So that's the science. But then the question, what do you do about it? Then that becomes a political, economic, social issue. I mean, there are all kinds of arguments about what we should do about that, that bring in different points of view. And so I would like to continue to insist that even though there are political and economic incentives, but I think that in many of these issues, there is basic science at the core. That doesn't necessarily tell you what policies the government should make, but I do think that that we have, over the last couple of decades, developed an anti-science climate in this country, where people are really, many people, not everybody, but many people are skeptical of science. They're skeptical of the recommendations made by the CDC. For example, we saw that during the pandemic. And one of the reasons why people were skeptical is because the CDC and the World Health Organization changed their recommendations. And so that led many people to say, well, science is just wishy-washy. It's driven by economic and political interests. But that reaction, I think, is due to a lack of understanding of critical thinking in science. We change our recommendations when we have new data. And in the first year of the pandemic, the CDC and the World Health Organization did not have much data on COVID-19. And so initially they said, for example, that masks are not helpful, and so on. And as they got more data, they changed their recommendations, and that's the way that science works. We revise our theories if we need to when we have more data.
Well, that's another great point to pause for a moment as we go to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll dig a little deeper into that, the question of big science and where it and Alan Lightman is going next. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Alan Lightman here on Created in the Image of God.
Award-winning and best-selling author Dr. Scott Guerin invites you into a journey unlike any other. A journey into who we truly are and who we are becoming. Humanity is standing at the threshold of profound change. We are awakening to our divine nature, to our galactic heritage, and to our connection with the stars themselves. In this book, Dr. Guerin reveals the remarkable shifts reshaping our understanding of mind, body, spirit, and our place in the universe. This awakening begins by rethinking everything we know about the physical and the non-physical. And with clear, enlightening insights, he guides you step by step through two major transformations: our reconnection to our divine essence and the opening of contact with our ET neighbors. Some of these ideas may feel familiar, like echoes from a faraway home. Every great shift in human history has changed our world, but this one will be bigger than all of them. Awkward Awakening: Finding Your Way Home by Dr. Scott Guerin.
Welcome back to the concluding segment of Created in the Image of God for the special December 30th show. And right before the break, we were talking about recommendations being changed when new data comes in specific to the pandemic. And I think another big reason why a lot of people are skeptical, yours truly included, to the degree that I'm skeptical, here's one of the reasons why. And I'll ask you, Alan, your take on this. Not just that recommendations were changed as new evidence came in, but along the way, definitions were changed. I remember a very specific moment where the definition of vaccine on a CDC site was changed and modified over the course of this unfolding. And we can all look back and remember whether that was true or not. Don't necessarily want to debate that fact. I personally believe that it was changed along the way. Whether that's true or not, generally speaking, people knew what they thought a vaccine was a decade ago. And today, if you go look at the definition, it's not exactly what we thought it was. And again, along the way, the reason for that definition change and why it was important or not important was also then explained, right? Which eroded people's trust when you were told you had to get a vaccine. In my particular family, my wife is a healthcare worker. She had to get the vaccine very early on. I did not initially have to get it. Then the pressure was increased on who needed to get it. My daughter in school, myself, my son. We all faced that question at different times as this was unfolding in real time and impacting our lives and decisions that people were being forced to make.
Yeah, well, I think it's unfortunate that the definition of the vaccine was changed, and I think in a case like that, that the scientific institution needs to take pains and time to explain why they're changing the definition, and that's very, very important. And I'm not very familiar with how the CDC changed its definition, but it may or may not have been negligent in not giving a careful and respectful explanation.
In layman's terms, what was going on was the idea that if you got the vaccine, you would not get the disease. But then what happened was, no, you would still get the disease, but it would not be as severe, and therefore the vaccine would protect your life because you would still come down with the actual disease, but you would have had an immune reaction that protected you and so on. And then there was a further question about, well, is the vaccine itself causing shedding? Are people who are not vaccinated catching the disease from people who got the disease from having been vaccinated? So you have this succession of questions, right? Now, I don't know if the science is settled on all that, but it's unsettling.
Right. Well, I totally appreciate that. And I think that what you described, the initial statement that if you get the vaccine, you can't get the disease, and then later the qualification of that, if you get the vaccine, you'll have a less virulent case. That sounds to me exactly the way science proceeds when it gets more data. And so that's revision based upon new information.
But traditionally a vaccine, a polio vaccine, 99.9%, you're not getting the disease. Therefore, that's why the definition of vaccine would have been changed.
Yeah. So this is due to a case of the scientists at the CDC not understanding the phenomena well enough. And I think that it's incumbent upon scientists and scientific institutions, and it's a responsibility of them to carefully explain what we know and what we don't know. And we just have to respect the intelligence of the public to be able to go along with us. But the CDC may have been in error by stating too definitively at the beginning that if you get the vaccine, you're not going to come down with COVID. I think that the responsibility, as I said, of scientists and scientific institutions is to be careful in communicating to the public and careful in delineating what we know and what we don't know.
Well, and it may not even have been that they definitively stated that, because the generally accepted idea of a vaccine was that, and you know what I'm saying? And so thus the definition changed, because it wasn't, whether they did or didn't state it, I don't even know. But generally speaking, we now have a more nuanced understanding of what a vaccine might be.
Right. Yeah. So now you're getting to a more sophisticated level where scientific institutions really need to understand a little bit of psychology and sociology, and not just the science, and understand how the public will be receiving certain things and what their preconceptions are. So it's a very good point that when a scientific institution or an individual scientist speaks to the public, they need to know who that public is and where they're coming from and what their information base is, what their mental state is, all of that. That would be helpful and would have been helpful in the case that you're describing.
So in the future of science and for our species, as we become even more interconnected, as we become even more homogenous in a way, right, through instant communications, through Internet, technology, through AI, right? How will science evolve? And is there a certain humility that maybe has come in through this? Was there some hubris? I mean, many decades ago, right, they were predicting, whatever, all of the things that science would accomplish, and how it would change our life. And you can go back and read magazines from 30 years ago. It's kind of, or 50 years ago. It's kind of funny as to what the predictions were. Many of them were accurate, but some of them are like really out there. Right.
Yeah. Well, I think humility is a good word, and I think that scientists and scientific institutions do need to have a certain humility and a certain modesty, if you will, about things that we claim. Now, all of that said, I think science has been one of the greatest forces in shaping human civilization throughout our history. In fact, I would say probably science and religion have been the two greatest forces in shaping human civilization. And both of them are here to stay. I think both science and religion need to have a certain amount of humility and respect for other people. I have just recently published a book called The Shape of Wonder: How Scientists Think, Live, and Work. I co-authored it with a very distinguished British astronomer named Martin Rees. And in the book, we do have a whole chapter on the responsibility of scientists and scientific institutions. And it's very much along the lines that you and I have just been discussing.
Could you repeat the title of that?
It's called The Shape of Wonder: How Scientists Live, Think, and Work.
The Shape of Wonder: How Scientists Live, Think, and Work. Would love to get a copy of that. I'll have to look it up. I'm sure we can get it on Amazon or anywhere books are sold.
Yeah, you can get it anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the collaborative effort like working on that book together with the gentleman? What was his name again, from England?
Martin Rees.
Martin Rees.
Yeah, he was the president of the Royal Society in England, which is their equivalent of our National Academy of Sciences, and he was also the Royal Astronomer of England. And there's only one Royal Astronomer at a time. I've known him for years, and he's a very deep thinker and also a very humble man. Speaking of humility, so it was great. He's a colleague of Stephen Hawking that we were talking about earlier. They're both at the Institute of Astronomy in England. Hawking had several affiliations. It wasn't only with the Institute of Astronomy, but they were both colleagues.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. We're just about out of time. It's been truly a joy and a pleasure, and I really feel like I've learned a lot. And I'll be cogitating on this and writing a little article about what I learned after the show comes out. But what final thoughts would you like to leave with the audience today after having gone through these big questions, these philosophical questions, and looking at science, past, present, and future?
Well, I don't know whether this is relates to science, but I'm reading a new book by a philosopher named Rebecca Goldstein. And the book is called the Mattering Instinct. And she talks in the book about what matters to each of us. Why do we long to matter? For our lives to matter. And I've thought about this for many years. And I think and each of us has a different answer to that question. What makes my life matter? What makes my life worthwhile? I've grown up with a certain amount of privilege. I had a middle-class family. I got a good education. My parents were educated. And I think that those of us who have privilege have a responsibility to help other people who don't have the same advantages that we do. And that's what makes my life matter.
What are some of the ways in which you do that, in which you accomplish that, to extend what you have in love and generosity to other people?
Well, about 20 years ago, I started a nonprofit organization that works in Southeast Asia called Harpswell. And we help empower young women to become leaders. And many of them come from very poor families. So that's something that I have done that I feel good about. It's helped me feel like my life matters. And of course, those of us who have children, we can feel like, we're contributing to the future if we give them the values that we think are important.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. It's the inverse of that. I also have, I won't say that I come from privilege. There will be those who look at me and will say, well, of course you're a white male. Yeah, well, if you were kidnapped at age 9 and smuggled out of the country and ended up in an orphanage and lived in a tent in Alaska to get through your senior year of high school, you know, you might not feel so privileged. But having said that, my children, they had none of those experiences, right? So I'm very aware of trying somehow to work with them and educate them, to give them all the opportunities and everything that they should have and that you would want your children to have, and yet instill in them, you know, something that is the opposite of entitlement, right?
Yes.
And expectation that this is the way it always is, and make sure that and it's tough. It's tough to figure out how to do that.
Well, I know that you've had a pretty amazing background in which you overcame a lot of obstacles, and I imagine that your kids recognize that and admire.
You know, they don't want to hear about it. It's the standard. Oh, come on, Dad. You know, do we have to hear the tent story again?
Well, they'll think about it more as they get older, I guarantee you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Alan, what a pleasure. And give us the title of that new book one more time.
It's called The Shape of Wonder: How Scientists Live, Think, and Work. But if you can't remember the subtitle, just The Shape of Wonder.
Shape of Wonder. Well, Alan, it's truly been a pleasure. I thank you so much for giving us this time today and for sharing it with the audience. I hope everybody got as much out of it as I have. There's one more thing left to do today, and that's for the sneak peek for next week's show. So for the audience, stay tuned, and you'll have a quick preview of what's coming next. And Alan, all the best in the new year, as we sound that tomorrow night, because it's December 30th. When this show is airing, and it's been truly a pleasure. I'll continue to follow you and invite you back at some point in the future if you're willing to continue this discussion.
Well, thank you, Wade. It was a pleasure talking to you, and you had a lot of interesting things to say. So I learned from you as well as you learned from me.
Well, thank you so much. It's very generous of you. We'll see you all next week. For the rest of you, remember, you are created in the image of God, or you know, you're part of this vast universe of wonder, and God loves his creation, and you are loved by the universe. So we'll see you all next week. Hey everyone, Wade Fransson here with a sneak peek of this coming Tuesday night's show. I have an amazing woman in the studio with me. Her name is Audley Rindlisbacher, and she is the Mission-Driven Mom. She's the founder of the Mission-Driven Mom and the author of The Mission-Driven Life. And we have her here to tell us all about that. Welcome to the studio, Audrey.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So where did the idea come from of a mission-driven life and these signature 7 laws of life? Where did all that come from?
It came from, I don't know if you or your audience have ever read The Hiding Place, but it's the story of a family in Holland during World War II. It's a true story of how they saved the lives of 800 people, over 800 people. And when I first read the book, it was more about them as a family. And I was in the middle of raising a bunch of little kids, and I just knew I wanted to be just like them. And I had no idea how to get there. And eventually I found other books written by the author, Corrie ten Boom. And what I discovered was that they weren't always the super amazing people that we meet in The Hiding Place. They also had many of the same problems and issues. They had, you know, we struggled with our finances, with our business, with our marriage, with addiction, with our parenting. They had many of those same problems. So I went on a search to study them and other heroes. You can see some of the heroes on my wall behind me. Study the lives of dozens of men and women, trying to figure out how did they become so amazing? How did ordinary people become extraordinary? And I found these common laws that they all lived that took them from just the same kind of ordinary, troubled people that I was to where they became these amazing people that had this positive impact in the world.
So obviously there's a lot of inspiration, faith, courage that is needed to even begin to aspire to be that kind of an exceptional family.
Yeah.
Does how much of it is the vision, mission, faith, and how much is it of the practice of the principles? What's the mix there? Is it 50-50,
Oh, wow.
80-20?
You really hit it though. It starts with the practice of the principles. That's what we do best at the Mission Driven Mom, is teach people what principles are, why they matter, and how to live them. And that's really, we call it practicing principles, and it's following in their footsteps to live the laws and principles that they lived. And you don't believe you're ever going to do anything amazing when you get started. You just don't. But you know you have problems that you'd love to solve. You know you'd love to be more connected in your marriage. You know you'd love to be a more present parent, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's where you start. You start with where you are right now. And eventually it takes you places you wouldn't think you would be able to go.
So you don't really have to have that sort of vision, mission clearly in mind. You just start down the path.
Yep. You just get plugged in. You start where you are. You do the next right thing. And it takes you on a really amazing journey.
Well, very cool. I can't wait to unpack all that over the course of an hour coming up on January 6th. We were joking in the studio about, yes, January 6th, the insurrection. We recently had a gentleman on who was actually involved in that. So, this is your own insurrection. This is your own goal to change your life and take charge. Sorry if anyone takes offense at that, but it just happens to be January 6th, and we're starting a movement here. So Audrey, thank you for taking the time to be with us here today, and for everyone in the audience, be there for episode 210, January 6th, 8 p.m. Central Time on Created in the Image of God. We'll see you there.